everyone, my name is Evie Lupine and welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. And today I need to admit to something. I was wrong. About what exactly? Well, pleasure dominance. I made a video about it a couple of years ago, and my thoughts about the topic have definitely evolved since then. So I thought it was high time to come clean and revisit it and try to approach it now from a new perspective. And with that being said, let's talk about it. So what exactly is pleasure dominance? It is essentially a way of approaching BDSM that focuses on the physical pleasure of the bottom or S-type partner. Typically, though not exclusively, this means focusing on sexual acts and genital stimulation. At the time my original video came out a couple of years ago, I was concerned about what this term might lead to in our community. This was still more or less during the height of the pandemic, and we'd seen an explosion in the kink community online as well as on social media. There seemed to be a whole separate world of people who were discovering kink on TikTok and only learning about it through that platform, which to this day kind of blows my mind. And so this led to people coming up with insular terminology I had never heard anywhere else, or trying to reinvent the wheel because they didn't have access to or just were not interested in the broader offline BDSM world. So you had things, for example, like vanilla dom. Still don't know what that one means, but there was one contrivance in particular that really stuck with me, and that was hard and soft dominance. While terms like gentle femdom have been around for a long time, this distinction really took shape and exploded on TikTok, when only a couple of years ago, I had never heard anyone refer to their style preferences that way. I mean, edge play, definitely. Hardcore, you bet, but not soft or hard in that way. And unfortunately, as is so often the case with terminology like this, there was soon a lot of stereotyping and pigeonholing. Soft was talked about as being lighter, loving, romantic, and gentle, and hard by comparison was discussed as being cruel, unkind, cold, unloving, with the often unstated undercurrent that doing moderate to intense pain play was inherently hard, and that things like praise kink or pet play were soft, and that hard was bad or more dangerous, and that soft was safer. And I was concerned about this because kink is such a massive variable thing. There's nothing inherent to sadomasochism that means that you can't also be sweet and loving. In fact, for a lot of people who do kink, being made to be in pain or to cause their partner pain is an act of love. And likewise, doing stuff like praise kink isn't always soft either. Affirmation play and praise can be emotionally rough, and you can end up crying afterwards just as much, if not more, than you would if you had instead been spanked the entire time. And so I didn't like the judgment that seemed to underlay all of this, because I didn't want people to feel ashamed or unnecessarily afraid because they wanted to do things like impact play. And I definitely didn't want people to think that they needed to accept certain kinds of treatment from a partner just because they call themselves hard. Like it's a warning label. You know, warning, I'm a hard dom, so I'm gonna disrespect your boundaries. And also, I was scared for sadists too, because we're in a vanilla culture where you are made to feel like a villain if you want to cause someone else pain, without any exceptions for consent or mutual desire. But to potentially have that same kind of attitude coming from fellow kinksters because traditional sadism is like too scary or something, well, I mean, that just broke my heart, to be honest with y'all. And so I was worried about a similar kind of treatment happening when pleasure dominance came along. You know, more pigeonholing, more unnecessary walls, because, I mean, I personally think that as time has gone on for my own kink journey, I have really just gotten a lot less focused on labels. And I realized how, at least for me, they'd often become a limiting factor to how I explored kink. People would or wouldn't approach me based on what labels I would use, or they would treat me differently because they thought that they knew something about me based on what labels I used as well, and they were almost always wrong, or because I looked a certain way, or because of how I chose to self-identify or not, and it was a mess. So I didn't love the idea of newer, even smaller, tinier boxes being made for people to put themselves in, often well before they'd even had any measurable experience actually doing kink. However, I do know that labels are essential for some people, and they do serve an important purpose in our community. So if we are going to adopt any of these labels, they ought to be worthwhile, and they really should contribute to facilitating conversations and greater understanding, not just more box making and judgment, because we don't need more of that, okay? We get enough of it from the vanilla world. And so Pleasure Dom gained a lot of steam on TikTok, and that made me skeptical it was going to be used in an unhealthy, impractical way. TikTok is infamous for turning anything into a consumption-driven micro-label, water talk, book talk, the vanilla girl aesthetic, the cherry aesthetic, or whatever it is we're currently on whenever this video comes out. Yeah, I did not want to see any of that happening to a kink thing. And so my assessment in my original video was fairly harsh because of this, especially with the way it was being talked about on there, as well as in other places like blogs, while also noticeably being broadly absent from larger kink-focused social media like FetLife. There were inklings here and there, but not much. I just wasn't sure it really had that much utility in a practical kink sense. And in fact, I was skeptical that it was maybe just a reinventing the wheel situation born out of terms like soft and hard gaining traction in the first place, because at the time, a lot of the conversation about it was more or less something you could boil down to, wow, my dom cares about my pleasure, as though that happening is a unique, different, special thing compared to regular BDSM where doms don't care about that stuff, because hard had been equated to standard mainstream BDSM. The assumption was therefore by default that doms don't care about their partner's pleasure because, hard doms are scary and bad. And that to them, it was all about just your pain and your suffering, and that doms like that, traditional hard doms, are otherwise completely self-centered when it comes to sexual pleasure and only want to deny you while making sure that their needs are fulfilled first, of course. I felt uncomfortable with the idea that we needed a separate term just to say, my dom also likes it when I get off too. Isn't that special? Because it might normalize the idea that is a notable thing that needs a label and that it is unusual. When in reality, if someone is a good partner, but especially a romantic partner as well as a kink one, they should care about what you like and want as well, regardless of what label you use and regardless of what body parts it happens to use as well. It's just what people want and how they act on it that ends up looking different. And I guess because some folks can't imagine wanting a flogging or whipping for its own sake, they assume that there is no kindness or pleasure in that. That kind of thing has to be mean and uncaring implicitly, when obviously for many people, those things are not just highly pleasurable, they are their preferred form of intimacy with a partner above and beyond any kind of genital stimulation or traditional intimate physical touch. Yes, someone can be crying and begging for mercy, but still be having a good time. You can't judge what someone is experiencing internally from your external perception. Even the biggest, meanest sadist dom starts from a place of asking, or should start from a place of asking, so what do you also want to experience? What do you like? Because even when things look really rough and scary, we should still care about each other. There should not be a race to the bottom to see who can care the least, as is what happens, for example, in vanilla hookup culture. So there was that issue for one. And then on top of that, there was also the fact that I had noticed what seemed to be a parallel shift in how cishet people were talking about their sexuality and approach to intimacy. For a long time, it was unmanly and even taboo to go down on your woman, or really to use anything except your you-know-what to bring someone any kind of pleasure. To this day, there are still a vocal minority of people who think silicone replicas and vibrating toys are a threat to their relationships, rather than being what they actually are, which are helpful tools you can choose to use or not. But for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why, at least part of this perspective changed really rapidly over the course of a couple of years. Now, rather than ignoring women's pleasure entirely, a lot of men started to take masculine pride in how much pleasure they could give a woman. Rather than it just being impossible in the first place or a nuisance, some guys decided to then, now, out of nowhere, base their entire sexual ego around how much they could get their partner off. And while this might superficially sound like a good thing, what ended up happening was that women's physical pleasure came into the focus, but in a way that almost didn't involve individual women's real needs and desires at all. It was presumed that all women liked receiving oral, that they wanted to come first, that they would appreciate external stimulation, so on and so on and so on. Because, guess what? People didn't learn how to stop and have conversations first. They just replaced one set of assumptions with another that maybe sounded better on the surface. And even then, if the woman did like what was happening, if she did happen to get off, her pleasure ended up being more about the fact that the man could do that to her. How good he was at doing it, how often he could do it. It was like the sexual equivalent of bragging about what a good person you are because you volunteered at a soup kitchen twice a month for a while. And aren't you just such a saint for going out of your way to do that? All while simultaneously ignoring the very people that you were supposedly helping. If you go through any dating app these days, you will no doubt see guys like this. People who assume that if they brag about how good they are at doing this or that to a woman, it'll impress a girl and make him stand out. When really, for a lot of dudes, it's the same self-centered ego stroking, as always, with just a little bit of an altruistic veneer. And this dynamic was in my head when I was talking about pleasure dominance, both because it was being treated as this super notable special thing to care about someone else's pleasure in the first place as a dom, and because it was being discussed in a 95+% heterosexual context, where this sort of like, hey, give me brownie points because I'm not scared of doing oral thing is rampant. It seemed like we maybe might be mislabeling otherwise vanilla intimacy in which women got off as being a kink thing. Which, yeah, don't love that. It's not a kink when a woman happens to be able to. But I've expanded my mind about a lot of this. So, yes, all of those concerns I have been describing for like 15 minutes are still a factor in one way or another. But I do think that there is a way to approach this that is not only kinky, but it is distinct enough from other styles of play to warrant its own label. And you can see the first hint of this in the description I gave about a focus on women's pleasure being treated not as something good for its own sake, but being an ego-feeding tool for a man. I think when done in an ethical, intentional way, you could play with this concept. It is, essentially, giving up authority over your desires and pleasure to someone else. And hasn't that existed already in kink in various forms for a long time? There's chastity, edging, orgasm control, and denial, training, and a bunch of other stuff too. Maybe, instead, we could think about pleasure dominance not just as shorthand for dude who likes his partner enough to bother to also get her off or talk to her about what her body likes, but instead as shorthand for an umbrella term that includes all of those sexual control-focused forms of play, with a bent that ultimately the goal is pleasure and not just denial and pain alone, although those could be elements simultaneously in pleasure dominance, I would think. Plus, I think this would make the term inherently more queer inclusive, whereas right now it seems to be uniformly coded as heterosexual, at least where I run across it. And I think in order to get there, the approach has to be different. Maybe, for example, it's more about using pleasure as a tool for pain. Maybe it's about controlling access to a part of someone's body and being able to manipulate it how you please. Maybe it's about having free use and being able to do whatever you want to any part of someone. And from the complete opposite direction, it might even be a caretaking thing. I mean, heck, a lot of folks do self-pleasure as a way to relax and de-stress, so why not include your partner in that process to help you do that? And none of these perspectives necessarily mean anything about the way pleasure is given, what body parts are or are not being used, or even if orgasm is involved or not. And like all other forms of kink, it ought to be done with explicit intentional negotiation up front, where both parties can share what they like, dislike, why, and what they each would like to get out of the experience. That way it starts from a truly egalitarian base and avoids the pitfalls of how vanilla culture still so often approaches sex. My one gripe is, even with this, pleasure dominance is a bit euphemistic for my taste. Because not all pleasure in kink is sexual, nor is it always kind. And it's also not like other forms of kink aren't pleasurable for the folks who are doing them. I'd maybe like to call it hedonistic dominance, since that emphasizes more of the mental framework behind it. I think, to me, the essence of pleasure dominance that makes it different from other forms of dominance is the focus on using enjoyable bodily sensations as a tool for control, which is precisely what hedonism is about. To me, that fits right in with other terms like rope top and the like. Or maybe we could just I don't know, call it plain old sexual dominance. I don't think any of these terms are perfect, but maybe they're worth considering. My other motivation for wanting to potentially change the term, or at least offer an alternative, is that I hope it will be better able to facilitate conversations. Like, I could see being a newbie A-spec person again and not knowing that pleasure dominance was code for sexual contact, and maybe instead thinking that it meant someone who wanted to play more in like a fun, silly way versus a stereotypically mean, cold way. Whereas if the term were hedonistic dominance, I would have picked up on the fact that it meant something sexual right away. But hey, 10 years ago when I was new, we used terms like pleasure and intimacy far, far less than we do now. And when we did, it wasn't as like code wordy, social media friendly, censorship escapey as it is today. Finally, I want to think about some ways you could approach pleasure dominance in your relationship. One, it's a big one, is orgasm torture, where someone orgasms so often against their will that it becomes painful. This to me is like the platonic ideal of a pleasure dominant scene, is taking something generally regarded as painless and joyful and desired and twisting it into a form of suffering. It checks all the boxes. It's got sadism, it's got control, it's got bodily pleasure, all wrapped up in one. And there's also the potential for the ever sought after CNC element too, where you can act like it's happening against your will, but nothing you do or say can stop it from happening. Or maybe it really is outside of your control because you've given up that level of bodily autonomy. There are a lot of possibilities here. Of course, how achievable this is varies wildly from person to person, and it is far from the only thing you could do. Orgasm training is next on the list, where you use behavior modification and positive reinforcement tools to teach someone how to orgasm on command or only under certain conditions. This runs the gamut from someone only being allowed to come in one specific position over to being taught to climax whenever a certain noise or code word is said. This one, however, is quite dangerous. Lots of people do this or try to do this only to have a relationship end and then be stuck not being able to get off for weeks, months, or even longer after that. Proceed with caution if you want to do that. And I also have another video on chastity already, so I won't dwell on that one here, but that is something you could try. And then finally, another kink that you could also give a whirl is when you're playing with pleasure dominance, you could also mix in humiliation play. You would not assume that this would work, but if someone is shy about their body or not comfortable about something pleasing them, doing a way over the top humiliating praise kink scene that loops back around into being super embarrassing could work super well for this. And then there's all the other ways you could use pleasure and sexuality to show submission towards your partner. Being ordered to keep a detailed fantasy diary, having some kind of daily sensual self-touch ritual that you record and give to your partner, doing guided exercises from your dominant to understand better what pleases you physically. The list goes on and on and on, and I think there's also things like anal training and deep throat training that could definitely overlap here as well. I think the point is, ultimately, no matter how you approach it, it would probably just be nice to decenter vanilla cis heterosexuality from the term pleasure dom. Like, folks, sorry, he is not your dom just because he's not scared to use a vibrator on you, okay? Okay. And so overall, in summary, I think pleasure dominance is a valid and worthwhile form of BDSM. I think it makes sense why it would have a different label. If someone's favorite thing to do at the dungeon is to bring their Sibby in and use it in public, who am I to judge? And especially as someone who primarily does non-sexual BDSM, I think it's good to have terminology that separates sexual activity from non-sexual BDSM and makes it distinct that both forms of kink are valid, and no matter what your approach is, like, what you're doing is still kink. Like, actually, maybe it might also help with the arguments that we have about, like, BDSM is inherently sexual. Like, if we have a whole separate term for, like, kink that is focused only on sex versus kink that's not, like, maybe that's a good thing. And again, not that pleasure dominance is just about sex. Like, I just spent a lot of time explaining different ways you could approach it that may or may not involve any kind of genital contact. But I think that would give it a lot of utility. And if this is something that you are curious about, there are definitely lots of ways to explore this in kink. No matter if you do sexual or non-sexual kink, it's all valid as long as you are doing it with consent. And it's something that you personally want to be doing. And just, if you run into a pleasure dom and they're like, well, look at me, I'm so cool because I actually want to make sure you also get off, like, pause and check in a little bit, because, yeah, it's not, in case you're watching this and you're trying to get a sense, is it unusual or special or novel for someone to also care about getting me off? No, it's not. It can be something you can intentionally play with, but there's also a lot of things in kink, right? Like, there's lots of things that, like, in a normal vanilla relationship, like, you know, the dynamic that a lot of people have with taking care of a household together, that classic dynamic of, like, one partner is kind of messy and thoughtless, and the other person is, like, very persnickety and very tidy, and the tidy partner feels put upon because all the cleaning stuff falls to them. You know, when then we turn around and we have domestic servitude and we have service submission, and it's turning something that in a vanilla context could be unspoken and negative, or maybe have certain stereotypes associated with it, and turning it into an intentional thing that actually can be really positive, where maybe you wouldn't have ever thought to do it that way in a vanilla context. Like, maybe the idea of having to pick up after a partner because they're simply too lazy to do it themselves is like a massive turnoff. But when you're intentionally doing it in a controlled setting, in a negotiated relationship, suddenly it's like super hot. Like, many such cases of things like that happening. So, pleasure dominance is real. I am sorry if I offended you. Hopefully you understand both my concerns and how I think it can be done. And it really does maybe just represent something that we were just kind of squishing under different labels and or not recognizing for whatever reason, and now we are, and it does seem like it is going to stick around. So regardless, maybe we just should have productive conversations about this no matter what. So with that being said, let me know your thoughts and feelings about this one in a comment down below, especially if you are somebody who is either curious about or plays with pleasure dominance in your relationship, especially if you are a pleasure dom. I would love to hear what your motivations are, what you do, how it works for you, and we can just have a conversation down below. If you did enjoy this and already, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different kink and BDSM related activities. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best you can do is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.